Hey class, in this first lecture, I'm just going to give a kind of a thumbnail sketch about the two different societies that developed in the United States between 1800 or so and 1860. In so many ways, the Civil War is a mystery uh, to a lot of historians. Historians still argue about the origins of the war, uh, especially given the fact that most Americans at this point, the greatest percentage of Americans, they were Protestant. Americans, especially white Americans, had a common history, the revolution against Great Britain. Um, the states were contiguous. The economies were deeply integrated. Much of the cotton that was grown in the South, the majority of the cotton that was grown in the South went to England, but a large portion of the cotton that was grown in the South went to northern factories. So the economies of the North and South were knit together pretty closely. So in terms of language, in terms of religion, in terms of culture, in terms of history, the North and the South shared so much. So why the Civil War? And really, it all comes down to slavery. And it may seem simplistic, but sometimes the simplest answer is the best answer. We've never had in our history anything that has caused the tensions between sections, such as the institution of slavery. And the political differences that cause the economic differences, social differences, differences in worldview. There's nothing to compare in our history. There's a lot of in 2023 and the 2020s. There's a fracture in American society that we're well aware of, but there's nothing that compares to slavery. There's often talk, or especially in recent years, there's talk about a new civil war breaking out in the United States. I just think that's ridiculous. I think we could have civil conflict. I think people could start killing each other in different areas of the country over political differences. But I don't see a civil war at all. The circumstances are just too different. And there's nothing like slavery that exists today that existed in the 1800s. So let me give you some quick facts and figures about the North and the South. By 1860, the United States population was 31 million or so, 31 million, about 400,000. And I'll put some of this in my outline. I don't want to drive you crazy with facts and figures, but I do want to get a sense. I want you to get a sense of the real story from big picture economically between 1800 and 1860. It's a story of incredible growth in the United States and the growth of the U.S. economy. For instance, and don't write this down, but just to give you a sense, the population in 1850 of the U.S. had been 23 million, and 10 years later, it's 31 million, 400,000 in just a 10-year period. In 1860, the South had about 8 million white citizens and 4 million slaves, compared to 20 million whites in the North. So in 1860, when the Civil War breaks out, there were more than twice as many whites in the North as there were in the South. At the beginning of in 1800, beginning of the century, there were about 1.2 million slaves in the United States, concentrated to a huge extent in the states of the South. The South of Pennsylvania, Delaware had slavery, Maryland, but the slave states went from those areas, of course, into areas such as Alabama, Mississippi, and, as we know, Texas. So in 1800, just to repeat, about 1.2 million slaves. By 1860, there were 4 million slaves in the United States. And the reason for this wasn't really because of the importation of slaves from Africa. We know, or you should know by now, that the Constitution, one of the deals of the Constitution is that the importation of captives, those kidnapped from Africa into the United States, was supposed to stop in 1808. It didn't completely stop, but it pretty much stopped. You basically you do have a trickle of captives being smuggled into the United States by 1808. But in large part, slavery from Africa, the exportation of African captives, those enslaved into the United States after 1808 stops. So why the dramatic increase in growth of slaves? Because what you had in the U.S. was natural reproduction of slaves. You had a more even proportion of male to female slaves. In the United States, for instance, Jamaica, the vast majority of slaves were male. Also, as horrible as slavery was in the United States, and of course it was quite horrible, we saw that in Jacobs. It was even worse in places like Jamaica, where it was actually cheaper to work a slave to death than it was to try to take decent care of a slave. And so you had conditions for the natural reproduction and actually the growth of the slave population in the United States, relatively speaking, and underlining relatively, the situation for slaves in the United States lent itself to natural reproduction. As I said, the ratio of male and female was much more even. And of course, slaveholders were willing to have slave children because they could sell slaves. Any slave that was born of a slave that you owned, a slave female that you owned, was your slave. The point being that you have dramatic growth in the number of slaves in the United States between 1800 and 1860. By the way, the other two great areas of slavery in the Western Hemisphere at this point were Cuba, where slavery still existed. Slavery wouldn't be banned in Cuba, I think, until the 1870s. And also Brazil. Slavery is an outlaw in Brazil until actually the 1890s. One side note, there had been slavery in places like Jamaica and other British Caribbean colonies. But in the late 1830s, the British, who were abolitionists before the United States, in the late 1830s, the British abolished slavery in their colonies, which was a very, very significant move, a real blow to slavery globally. It wasn't perfect, but nonetheless, it was a significant milestone. And it was one that American slaveholders looked at and were very, very worried about. So what you have is this tremendous growth in the United States in terms of population, both the North and South, the population of whites, but also the population of the enslaved in the South. At the same time, you start having in the northern states, especially in the states where slavery didn't exist, you start having opposition to slavery. Some of that opposition was moral because of the horrors of slavery. But for most northern whites who were deeply racist, the problem with slavery, as they saw it, was that it was in competition with the system of labor, which was in the North, which was what we call free labor. And I'll talk about that